He made 2 cups of coffee that morning, same as every morning for the past 51 years, one for himself and one for Eleanor. He set hers on the other side of the table, pulled out his chair and sat down slowly, the way a man sits when his knees have stopped asking permission and simply demand respect. The steam rose from both cups in the pale early light, thin and quiet, curling toward the ceiling like something trying to find its way out. He wrapped both hands around his own cup and stared at hers, and the house around him was so perfectly silent that he could hear the clock on the wall marking each second with the patient indifference of something that has never once had to grieve. He had been doing this for 13 years. 13 years since Eleanor left. 13 years since the house went quiet in a way that no radio, no open window, no amount of morning light had ever been able to fix. And still, every single morning, his hands reached for the second mug before his mind could catch up and remind them. Some habits live deeper than memory. Some love runs deeper than the mind's ability to correct it. Outside, the Blue Ridge Mountains were just beginning to catch the first gray light of dawn. Asheville was still sleeping. The road in front of his little house was empty and still, the way roads are only in those few sacred minutes before the world remembers it has somewhere to be. Franklin Hayes sat in that stillness and breathed it in. And if you had seen him from the doorway, this old man, 105 years old, sitting alone at his kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and the whole quiet morning around him, you might have thought he looked peaceful. You would have been half right. He had learned across 100 years of living that peace and grief are not opposites. Some mornings they sit together at the same table, and you simply make room for both of them. People had been asking him the same question for years. Journalists drove up from the city with their recorders and their notebooks. Doctors called wanting to understand his blood work, his habits, his routines. A television crew came once with bright lights and a young woman who smiled with the practiced warmth of someone whose job required it. They all wanted the same thing, the secret, the formula, the precise combination of choices and habits that have kept this one particular man breathing and thinking and walking while everyone around him had quietly, one by one, disappeared. And for years, Franklin gave them the answer they wanted. He talked about simple food, eggs cooked in butter, black coffee, fresh vegetables from the garden out back. He talked about walking every morning, sleeping 8 hours, carrying worry gently when you couldn't avoid it entirely. He talked about a small glass of bourbon during winter storms, just enough to remind himself that some pleasures were worth protecting. People wrote it all down with satisfied expressions, the way people look when they receive confirmation of something they already believed. And every time Franklin watched their cars back out of his driveway and disappear down the road and felt something heavy and unspoken settle back into his chest, because not one word of it was the real answer. He grew up in Tennessee, the second son of a tobacco farmer, in a house where luxury meant enough firewood to last the winter and enough food to go around the table without anyone pretending they weren't still hungry. He learned what hard work meant before he learned what rest meant, and he learned that life did not pause to ask whether you were ready. It simply arrived, and you either met it or you didn't. He served when his country asked him to, came home quieter than he had left, and eventually made his way to Chicago in 1951 with $30 in his pocket and the particular burning ambition that belongs to young men who have not yet been defeated by anything permanent. He became a taxi driver, not because it was his dream, but because it paid, and because Franklin had understood something about himself early. He was a man who needed motion the way other men needed silence. Behind the wheel of that cab, moving through the great humming organism of a city, he found a kind of peace he could never quite locate anywhere else. He drove that taxi for 43 years, and in those 43 years, the back seat of that cab became the finest education he ever received. He drove nurses home at 2 in the morning, still in their scrubs, asleep before he had cleared the hospital parking lot.
He drove businessmen in expensive suits who stared out rain-streaked windows with the hollow, faraway look of men whose lives had arrived somewhere they never intended to go. He drove young couples full of heat and noise, and old couples sitting in the particular silence that only decades together can produce. Not emptiness, but something closer to music with all the notes removed, leaving only the feeling behind. He drove lonely men who talked the entire ride, not because they wanted conversation, but because they simply needed another human being to hear them for 20 minutes. Just hear them, nothing more than that. And Franklin listened. He always listened, because he had learned somewhere across all those miles and all those passengers that listening was not passive. Listening was one of the most active and necessary things a human being could do for another. One January night, cold enough that the puddles on Michigan Avenue had frozen solid and the city moved carefully, like a man afraid of falling, a passenger climbed into the back seat and gave an address on the north side. Franklin recognized him immediately. Dr. Leonard Miller had written 4 best-selling books on nutrition and longevity. His face appeared on magazine covers. People quoted him the way previous generations quoted scripture, with the complete confidence of those who have decided that a man is worth trusting and stopped asking further questions. They rode in silence for several blocks, the heater humming, the city passing in streaks of orange light and cold shadow.
Then Franklin, who had always believed that good questions were worth more than comfortable quiet, spoke carefully. "Dr. Miller," he said, eyes on the road, "you spent your whole life studying how people live longer. In your honest opinion, what is the real secret?" The doctor was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Franklin thought perhaps he hadn't heard. Then Dr. Leonard Miller said, slowly, "Eat well, sleep enough, manage your stress." Franklin nodded. He let a few seconds pass. Then, "And how does a man manage his stress in your experience?" The silence that followed was different from the first one. Heavier. The kind of silence that exists not because a man has nothing to say, but because he has been keeping something in for a very long time. Then Dr. Leonard Miller laughed, softly, into the cold air of that cab, and it was not a happy sound. It was the laugh of a man who has just been asked the one question his entire career was quietly built around avoiding. "I never figured that part out," he said, almost a whisper. He was looking out the window when he said it, and Franklin could see his reflection in the glass. A tired man, sitting in the dark, being honest, perhaps, for the first time in a long while. Dr. Leonard Miller died 11 months later of a heart attack. He was 71 years old. Franklin never forgot that night, not because he was glad the great man had been wrong, but because it confirmed something he had been slowly assembling across all those years of watching human beings in the back-guarded privacy of the back seat. The people who lived the longest were not always the healthiest people in the room. They were the people who still felt needed. Eleanor had loved him the way rivers love their banks. Not dramatically, not with great noise, but with a steady, patient, unmovable constancy that shaped everything it touched without ever calling attention to itself. They married in 1955, a small ceremony, a modest dress, a cake Eleanor's mother baked the night before, and a love that Franklin accepted the way men of his generation accepted most good things, quietly, with gratitude he rarely found the right words for. She waited through the Chicago winters and the long night shifts and the years when money was thin and the future was something you approached carefully rather than confidently. She waited and she stayed, and she built a life around the shape of him, the way you build a home around a good foundation, not because the foundation is beautiful, but because it holds. But there was something she told him,
gently at first, and then with the patient persistence of a woman who has said an important thing many times without being truly heard. "You're sitting right beside me, Frank," she would say, her voice carrying no sharpness, only a quiet and honest sadness. "But your mind is always somewhere else." He thought she was wrong. He came home every night, he provided, he stayed. In his understanding, that was presence. That was what love looked like when it was serious and responsible and real. He did not understand yet that being in a room and being present in a room are two entirely different things, and that the people who love us most can always tell the difference. Then retirement came, and Franklin discovered for the first time in his adult life what stillness actually felt like. No schedule, no fares, no city moving outside the window, no passengers needing to get somewhere, just the house and the days and the long unmarked hours spreading out in every direction without purpose or destination. He sank, though he didn't recognize it as sinking at first. He called it resting. He told himself he was adjusting, taking it easy, finally accepting what he had earned after all those years. He sat in his recliner and watched television for hours and absorbed nothing. Words and colors washing over him like water over stone, leaving no impression at all. Days passed and left nothing behind. Weeks dissolved into each other until time became a single long gray afternoon with no beginning and no end. Eleanor watched. She brought him coffee and tended her garden and kept the house moving around him, but he could feel her watching, and somewhere beneath the fog of those purposeless months, he understood that she was frightened for him in a way she hadn't been frightened before. Then, one November morning, she sat down across from him at the kitchen table, folded her hands, and looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face in 60 years of marriage. It was not anger, it was not frustration, it was grief, a very specific and devastating kind of grief, the grief of watching someone you love disappear while they're still sitting right in front of you. "Franklin," she said, her voice soft and steady, "you're not living anymore. You're just waiting." The words went into him like a key turning in a lock that had been frozen shut for a very long time. He did not answer. He sat very still and let those words find every corner of him, and in the silence that followed, he understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she was right, that somewhere in the long fog of those months he had been quietly surrendering, not dramatically, not with intention, just the slow, daily giving up of a man who had lost his reason to participate. The next morning, he went outside before Eleanor was awake. He walked around the side of the house to her garden, the small, carefully tended plot where she grew tomatoes and green beans and the particular variety of marigolds she had planted every year since before he could remember. He stood there in the cool morning air and noticed weeds pushing up through the dark soil between her tomato plants, small and determined and completely indifferent to whether they were wanted. Franklin crouched down slowly, painfully, every joint in his body lodging its formal objection, and pulled one free, then another, then another. He worked without thinking, without planning, his hands moving through the soil while the morning moved around him, and somewhere in that simple, purposeful, unhurried work, something that had been closed inside him for a long time began, very slowly, to open. 2 hours later, he stood up, knees aching, lower back filing its complaints, hands dark with soil up to the wrists, sweat soaking through the back of his collar despite the cool air. And he felt, for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, completely, entirely, undeniably awake. When he came back inside, Eleanor was at the kitchen sink. She heard him and turned, and when she saw him, the dirt on his hands, the particular look on his face, Something moved across hers that he recognized as the specific relief of a woman who has been quietly frightened and has just been given reason to breathe again. She didn't say a word. She turned back to the sink, and he heard her exhale, soft and slow, and that small sound said more than a speech could have. It was not gardening that saved Franklin Hayes. It was the return of something to live toward, not a grand purpose, not a legacy, not anything that would fit in a headline, but the simple, humble, necessary fact of being needed by something. Even something as small and uncomplicated as a row of tomato plants that would struggle without attention. From that morning forward, he built his days around small rituals the way you build a fire, carefully tending each piece until it catches and holds. Morning walks along the gravel road before the world woke up. Jazz records in the evening, the old ones that sounded like they were recorded in rooms full of honest feeling. Coffee on the porch whenever rain came in over the mountains. Long conversations with his neighbor Hank, a private and gruff man who talked about football the way scholars talked about history, with passion and absolute conviction. Small things, almost embarrassingly small. But those small things stitched him back together from the inside, and Franklin began to understand something he wished he had learned 40 years earlier. That this was not weakness, and this was not settling. This was the actual, unglamorous, essential work of staying alive. Then came the October morning that changed the shape of everything that followed. Eleanor had been declining in the slow, gentle way that some people decline, without drama, without crisis, without asking the people around them to rearrange their lives. She had been moving slowly, sleeping more, speaking a little less, though when she spoke, she chose her words with the care of a woman who understood they were becoming more valuable. She passed in the night, quietly, without struggle, in the bed she had slept in for 40 years, in the house she had made into a home, with nothing more than patience and love and the particular grace of a woman who never needed to be noticed to matter. Franklin woke the next morning at 5:45, same as always. His body did not know yet. He lay still for a moment, listening to the silence of the house the way he always did before the day began. Then he got up, shuffled
Down the hall, filled the kettle, set it on the burner, reached up into the cabinet for 2 mugs, one for him, one for her, same as every morning, same as it had always been, same as it would always be in the muscle memory of a man who had loved the same woman for 61 years. He made the coffee. He carried both cups to the table. He set hers across from him in her place, where it had always gone. He sat down. And then, in the silence of that kitchen, with the clock ticking on the wall and the birds beginning outside and the morning arriving with its complete indifference to what had happened inside this house, inside this man, he understood. He sat very still and watched the steam rise from Eleanor's cup in a thin, slow ribbon toward the ceiling. He watched it the way you watch something you know is ending, without looking away, without trying to hold it, just witnessing it with your whole quiet, broken heart. The ribbon grew thinner and thinner, and then it was gone, and the coffee had gone cold, and the full weight of what the rest of his life would look like settled onto Franklin Hayes slowly, the way a heavy snow settles, not all at once, but accumulating, each flake almost nothing, the total of them changing everything. When he finally stood, he did not do anything remarkable. He watered the garden, he walked to the end of the driveway and stood for a moment looking at the empty road. Then he went inside and called his son Daniel, and when Daniel answered, voice surprised and a little alarmed at the early hour, Franklin said only, "I wanted to hear your voice, son, that's all." A pause on the line. "Dad, are you okay?" "No," Franklin said honestly, "but I will be." He believed it when he said it, not because he felt it yet, but because he had learned across 100 years of living that sometimes you have to say the true thing before you feel it, say it out loud into the world, and trust that the feeling will find its way to you if you keep showing up for it. That day he survived, and the next, and the one after that. Not because grief disappeared, it didn't, it doesn't, and anyone who tells you otherwise has either never loved anyone deeply or has simply forgotten what it cost. But every morning he found one reason, one small, unheroic, ordinary reason to participate in the day. The garden needed water, the newspaper had arrived, Hank's team had played, and someone needed to hear about it. Daniel would call on Sunday, and Franklin wanted to be there when he did. One reason, every morning. That was all. And somehow, across 13 years of mornings, that was everything. Daniel was 79 years old now, a good man and a busy man, the kind of man who meant every promise he made and kept approximately half of them, not from carelessness, but from the genuine, exhausting reality of a life with too many obligations and not enough hours. For years, Franklin had accepted the postponed visits and the almost Sunday calls and the "I'll come soon, Dad" that stretched across seasons without arriving. Because he understood it. Because he had been that man. Because he had spent decades being too busy and too tired and too certain that there would always be more time. But one spring afternoon, sitting on his porch, watching a red-tailed hawk ride the thermals above the ridge with a patience he deeply envied, something shifted in him. He picked up the phone and called his son. Daniel answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the background noise of a busy life, some office sound or traffic, or simply the particular hum of a man always in the middle of something. "Dad, hey, everything okay?" "Everything is fine," Franklin said. "I just need to tell you something, son." He paused, watching the hawk, thinking of Eleanor, thinking of all the things he had meant to say across all the years he had assumed were still ahead of him. "Daniel, I'm 104 years old. I have lived longer than almost anyone I have ever known, and I want you to understand something. There aren't many laters left, not for me, maybe not for any of us." The line was very quiet. "I'm not saying this to frighten you," Franklin continued, his voice steady and gentle. "I'm saying it because I spent a long time believing that love could survive on postponed time, that the real conversations, the honest ones, the ones that matter, I could save those for later. I want you to know what that cost me, son. I don't want it to cost you the same." He heard his son exhale on the other end of the line, a long, slow breath, carrying something that had been held too long. "I'll be there Saturday, Dad," Daniel said, and his voice was different now, quieter, stripped of the busyness, more like the boy Franklin remembered than the man he had become. "I'll drive up Saturday morning." "I'll make coffee," Franklin said. The following Saturday, Daniel arrived before noon. He pulled into the driveway and got out of his car, and when he walked toward the porch where Franklin was sitting, something in his face had changed. Some of the armor of a busy life had left it, replaced by something more open and uncertain and real. They sat on that porch for 6 hours. They talked about things that fathers and sons spend entire lifetimes carefully and lovingly avoiding, the regrets and the fears and the love that had always been enormous between them, but had so rarely been spoken in plain enough language to do its full work. They talked about Eleanor, about what it had been like to lose her, about what Franklin had learned in the 13 years since. They talked about what it felt like to be 79 and what it felt like to be 104, and how from certain angles those two ages felt closer than you might expect. At one point, without planning it, Daniel's eyes filled. He looked away quickly, out toward the mountains, the way men do when they are deciding whether to let something show. Franklin reached over and placed one weathered hand on his son's arm. "It's all right," he said quietly. "Let it." And Daniel did. He put his face in his hands and wept. Briefly, quietly, the way grown men cry when they finally allow themselves. And Franklin sat beside him and said nothing more, because nothing more was needed. After a while, Daniel looked up and wiped his face and almost smiled. "When did you get so wise, old man?" Franklin looked out at the mountains, at the last light moving across the ridgeline, at the evening settling in, slow and golden, the way evenings do when you have nowhere else to be. "I got old enough to stop being afraid of the truth," he said. "That's all it ever is." Now, on a quiet Tuesday morning in early March, Franklin Hayes sits at his kitchen table in the pale light of a new day. He is 105 years old. His coffee is warm between his hands. Eleanor's cup sits across from him, steam rising in that thin, familiar ribbon, the way it always does, the way it always will, for as long as he is here to make it. He has no interest in deceiving anyone anymore. Yes, eat real food, move your body, sleep when your body asks you to. These things matter, and he will not pretend otherwise. But they are not why he is still here. He is still here because every morning, even the ones that arrive dark and heavy and full of weight, he found one small reason to participate in the day. Because he kept the garden going after Eleanor left. Because he answered the phone even when silence felt easier. Because he said the honest thing to his son before it was too late for honesty to do its full work. He is still here because he learned, slowly and at great cost, that the people who vanish earliest are rarely taken first by their bodies. They are taken first by the quiet, private, daily surrender of their spirit. And Franklin Hayes, 105 years old, sitting alone at his kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and the whole slow morning ahead of him, refused. He keeps refusing. Every single morning, he refuses. That is his only secret. And now, finally, you have it. If this story found something in you, if it brought someone to mind, or reminded you of a conversation you have been postponing, or made you think of a cup of coffee sitting cold on somebody else's side of the table, please don't carry that quietly. Call the person, make the drive, say the true thing while there is still time to say it. Because Franklin is right, there aren't many laters left for any of us, and the days, these ordinary, unheroic, unremarkable days, they are not the waiting room. They are the life itself. Subscribe to the 11th Hour Last Words and stay with us. Every week we sit with lives that were quietly extraordinary, stories that deserved to be heard before time ran out. We will be here. Same porch, same slow morning light. We saved you a chair. This story carries genuine value beneath its emotion. It speaks honestly about what it means to outlive everyone you loved, not as tragedy alone, but as a particular kind of survival that requires daily courage most people never acknowledge or name. It addresses the invisible and deeply underreported crisis of purposelessness in aging men, the way retirement and loss can quietly hollow out a person while the world assumes they are simply resting and content. It teaches that purpose does not need to be grand or visible or impressive to be life-saving, that a garden, a morning walk, a neighbor's conversation can be the difference between a spirit that continues and one that quietly gives up. It carries an urgent and honest message about family, about the dangerous and common habit of postponing real connection with people who are running out of time. And at its heart, it offers a philosophy of survival that is both deeply truthful and genuinely hopeful. That living long is not about perfection or discipline or any secret formula, but about choosing every single morning to remain present in the life you have been given, however changed, however quieter, however different from the life you once imagined it would be.